Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Security IQ. Min?
Min Kyriannis here. You didn't introduce yourself.
I didn't. You all know who I am.
Sorry, I'm just busting your chops. You know who we are. But
And today we have back with us Jasmine Morales, which Jasmine, I cannot say your name as beautiful as you, so please say a quick hello to the audience.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jasmine Morales. It's a pleasure to be here.
And if you haven't already watched the first segment with Jasmine, just a short recap. She is brilliant. She is doing tremendous work in terms of working with victims and survivors in the area of human trafficking and exploitation, reaching out to communities, educating people. So if you have any interest in this topic, please connect with Jasmine. But we want her to talk a little bit. We invited her to come back to talk a little bit more about the US being the highest in terms of demand and global consumption of this type of material. And when I first heard this, I was shocked because, as we discussed in the last segment, most people think, oh, that's, a third world country problem. It's overseas. Sex tourism isn't relevant in the US. It couldn't be further from the truth. And we wanted her to just come back and give us a little perspective on the demand from the US versus global demand and what that all looks like. So Jasmine, if you would just lead us off a little bit and educate us a little.
Yeah, definitely. So I will start by talking about my prevention work. As mentioned in the previous segment, I do outreach and prevention education at Fair Girls. Initially, when I came onto the team, I realized that most of our prevention work was focused on, preventing it from a supply. And, I hate to put it that way because when I say supply, it refers to individuals. But the way that most organizations, individuals in general tackle the issue of prevention is by focusing on the folks that might be victimized. And I realized, okay, well, if there was no demand, then this wouldn't be an issue. So I started looking into where the demand is coming from. And in the US, there's been studies that show that consumers are predominantly white middle-class men, white middle to upper class men.
Wow.
And in thinking more about that, it kind of took me to an interesting point in realizing, okay, so those are primarily the consumers. Then who is being bought? And when we look at the statistics, it is predominantly women of color. So that kind of reflects, primarily Black women, that just reflects these, consequences of historical issues that we've seen if we think about, colonization and slavery. And when we think about the effects of these issues, I think that we don't really take time to think about the way in which a lot of white men, and again, I'm not trying to single all of you out, but white men,
we're just generalizing.
There is still this kind of, perception of being able to use specifically women of color's bodies. So just in thinking about the issue, it was really uncomfortable, as you could, I'm sure it is for you all to listen. And, we think of these issues of colonization, slavery, and all of those brutal and violent instances as being in the past. But as we think about and look at what is happening now, we see that there is direct effects. And
that ultimately slavery really never ended. That it just changed form. And, it doesn't just affect women of color. It affects a lot of people. In fact, if you're looking at human trafficking in general, there are a lot of young boys involved too. So, it's good to know these statistics. I'm so glad you're talking about that. But, everyone needs to be aware. This is everybody's problem. It cannot just be,
it just Yeah.
a woman of color problem. Everyone has a stake in this. And if there is a significant amount of demand coming from the US, coming from white males or whatever, everyone needs to jump in and help fix this problem.
Agreed. And just out of curiosity, you mentioned ethnic women or women of color. I mean, when you're helping these women in Fair Girls, like what's the percentage of women of color? Like, what are we talking about here?
Oh, Fair Girls, it's like 80% women.
Really, that much?
Predominantly Black African American women and girls. So
Really?
as mentioned, it's definitely an issue that could impact anyone, and it does impact anyone and everyone. But I think that the numbers show that it predominantly does.
So just getting into the psyche of that area, just these young ladies here. I'm not going to call them a women. I'm just going to call them young ladies. Mm-hmm. What was the psyche like? Is it because of the way they were raised? Is it the backing, or is it just because of they were in an area where they were growing up, which was underprivileged compared to other areas of where things were accessible? So it's not just cultural, but also the backing of how these young ladies were raised. In terms of not just
why is this an affliction for this particular community?
Exactly. Is it the education system? Is there the family life? Like what was it that they're not getting that they become the victims? They're so easily the victims here.
I think the answer is everything, unfortunately. Okay. When we think about systemic racism and the way that a lot of racial ethnic minorities are underprivileged and being able to receive a lot of needs, we know that the education system, workforce, healthcare is not built for racial ethnic minorities. And when you don't have those needs being met, you don't have those resources, it just opens up a space for someone to come and try to meet those needs. As we mentioned earlier, I believe it was in the prior segment, traffickers are professionals at identifying and meeting.
Right, identifying that particular community as vulnerable, which is really unfortunate. If we could go, I want to just make one more point. Sorry, I want to talk more about the consumption. I heard a statistic in one of the other organizations that follows trafficking issues globally, and it was they had mentioned, when we're talking about the psyche, Min asked the question about the psyche of the victims. What about the psyche from the people creating the demand? There's a scientist by the name of Dr. Hilton, I believe, and he recently published some research where they talked a little bit about the pleasure centers in the brain and how sex addiction and sex trafficking is sort of linked to similar triggers as narcotics, right? So if where people say, oh, is sex addiction really a thing? He's actually showing that when a child, when I say child, adolescent, looks at pornography, even if it's not something that's hardcore, it sends them down this pathway of more violent pornography, needing to be viewed to trigger those same centers in their brain. And then before you know it, it goes from basic pornography to more violent pornography to actually purchasing an individual and needing some level of violent behavior in that activity. And that's how you get down that path that we were talking about earlier of, not necessarily being born as a child predator, but then all of a sudden finding yourself in a situation where you're reacting in these criminal ways and you don't know how you got there. So when you look at the psyche of the victim, for sure, there are communities that predators will go after where there are vulnerabilities. But how are the predators developed? Do they all start out as predators? Not all of them, and we know this because of changes in sentencing laws and the creation of John schools. we want to try and get them before they become predators. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so as you were talking about the way in which people develop this porn addiction to the point where they have to watch more and more violent porn and end up purchasing someone to enact those actions, I was thinking about when I attended a conference and heard some survivor speakers. They were talking about all the very nasty things that the Johns would want to enact with them. And a lot of them do, I mean, I'm not going to go into detail, but a lot of them do very much mirror this kind of violent or very like weird fetishy, kind of porn. So yeah, I was just that's all to say that I have heard from survivors something that confirms what you mentioned. In terms of whether or not, they start as predators or what happens, gosh, they come from all backgrounds, from doing street outreach. So part of my role, both with Fair Girls and Her Resiliency, is street outreach. And with Fair Girls, we got into the DC community and we provide resources to individuals that are engaging in sex work, whether it may be survival sex or they're being trafficked. We just want to provide them resources to know that there are people that are able to help. And while we're out there, we see a lot of the Johns just driving around. It's anyone from a local construction worker to a local sergeant, you see, it ranges in the spectrum. And I think that they come from very various backgrounds. Some of them may have this kind of addiction. Some of them may just be looking for an escape at the moment and not realizing the harm, and not even realizing that the individual they're engaging with is there by force. Wow. Sometimes there are more clear pointers that could help you point to that. Okay, like if this person's really drugged up, if they look like they've been beat, but other times it may be more difficult for them to tell. Either way, it's not something that should be happening. But
no, agreed. I actually heard that this is a learned behavior from, for folks who are actually consumers, that the more they get, they just keep wanting more and more. And I don't want to use the analogy of a serial killer, but it's in retrospect, if you think about it, it's similar to that. I mean, I don't know. I think, Elisa, I sent you the article with the, police, who was it? The PBA?
Yeah.
The union boss who was recently coming down in Boston for really assaulting children. And this is the issue, is like, well, how do you fix this problem of the consumer? How do you get into that psyche and fix that?
Yeah. Well, and I feel like that's that really is the only cure, because the actual trafficking piece of it, the violent activity, the murders, all of that is a symptom of the bigger problem. And we have to get to the root of the problem, which is educating boys, because, and it sounds like educating white affluent boys, because I don't believe that anyone is born this way. I think more often than not, it is a learned behavior, and I'm not the expert, but when you read a lot of the research, a lot of experts will sort of reiterate that same idea. So if you can catch them earlier and educate them and, prepare them for things that they may see and may encounter, and prepare them to not learn from other people, what other people are doing, and that it's okay. That's where I think more conversation needs to be had. This way, we don't have organizations running around the world rescuing children, because there's no need for it. So I would love to hear more about John schools in another segment. And Jasmine, we'd love to have you back. If you can maybe even look into any of that, or you have materials that you want to share. And we'd love to share them with parents who are watching this, anyone who has a young child, a young boy in particular, to talk to them a little bit about this issue and get them ready that when they do encounter this, which they will at some point in their life, they know that this is a slippery slope, and you want to be ready to not set them up for that type of lifestyle. So, but thank you so much for joining us today. I hope this was great for the audience and helpful and educational. And we are definitely going to ask Jasmine to come back on. So stay tuned for the next episode.